An innocent war veteran is wrongfully accused, but what unfolds next will leave you stunned. When two arrogant cops think they can bully a retired veteran, they have no idea who they're messing with. From unjust accusations to a courtroom twist that turns the tables, this story of justice will have you hooked. Watch as a sharp-witted grandson steps in with a mysterious plan that exposes the system's flaws. You won't believe how it all ends. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Harold Wilkins was the kind of man legends were made of. At 67, he had a sharpness that could cut through steel and a presence that commanded respect. A Vietnam veteran, retired mechanic, and a survivor of countless battles, both on the field and in life, Harold had lived a life most couldn't fathom. His face bore the lines of hardship and wisdom, his hands calloused from decades of honest work. Yet, beneath that rugged exterior, there was an unyielding spirit, one that refused to be broken. Harold's pride and joy was his 1978 black Cadillac. It wasn't much to look at, its paint faded and its engine sputtering on cold mornings. But to Harold, it was a symbol of resilience, much like himself. That car had been with him through thick and thin, a relic of a bygone era, and he treated it with the care one might reserve for a prized heirloom. His life revolved around simple pleasures, his grandkids, a good blues record, and the quiet corners of Memphis he called home. Marcus, his oldest grandson, was a mystery wrapped in an enigma, always on assignments and never one to share the details. Marcus's life was a puzzle Harold never tried to solve. Family was family, and Harold wasn't one to pry. On a humid Friday night, the kind where the air clung to your skin and the streets were wrapped in an eerie stillness, Harold was heading home with a few groceries. The old blues crackled to the radio, a raw, soulful soundtrack to his solitary drive. The city lights blurred as he navigated the familiar roads, his mind lost in thought. Then it happened. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror shattered the tranquility. Harold's stomach sank. He muttered to himself, "Well, here we go," as he pulled over to the side of the road. Two officers emerged from the patrol car. They were young, brash, and carried themselves with an air of authority that barely masked their inexperience. One was chewing gum with exaggerated nonchalance, while the other strutted with the swagger of someone who watched too many cop shows. "Evening, sir," Gum Chewer greeted, his flashlight shining directly into Harold's eyes. "Mind telling us what you're doing out this late?" Harold, unflinching, replied, "Driving home. Last I checked, that wasn't against the law. License and registration," the officer demanded, smirking as if he'd already found his culprit. Harold handed over the documents without a word. Meanwhile, Swagger Boy peered into the car, his gaze sweeping over the back seat with suspicion. "What's in the trunk?" he asked, his tone laced with accusation. Harold chuckled dryly. "A spare tire and a toolkit. But hey, if you're looking for treasure, knock yourself out." The officers exchanged a knowing glance. Harold recognized the look. It was the prelude to trouble. "Step out of the car," Swagger Boy ordered. Harold sighed. He knew the drill. Late at night, on a deserted road, and a black man behind the wheel, it wasn't hard to see where this was going. But Harold wasn't one to panic. He exited the car, his hands visible, his demeanor calm. As they patted him down, Harold couldn't resist a touch of sarcasm. "Careful, boys. You might find a Werther's original in my pocket. Dangerous stuff." Neither of them laughed. The questions began, each one more absurd than the last. "Were you near 5th Street tonight? Did you pass the gas station around 9 p.m.? Know anything about a robbery?" Harold's patience thinned. "Robbery? I'm 67 years old. You think I'm out here pulling stick-ups? What's next, jaywalking?" Despite his protests, they slapped cuffs on him. "You're being detained for questioning." Swagger Boy declared, a smug grin plastered across his face. For what? Harold asked, his voice steady. We'll figure that out at the station, Gum Chewer replied, his tone dripping with mock authority. As they shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, Harold stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, plain and simple. Harold vowed silently that he wouldn't let them have the last word. The Cadillac sat abandoned on the roadside, its dim headlights casting an eerie glow. It was a witness to a crime that hadn't happened, a silent testimony to an unfolding injustice. The police station was a cold, unwelcoming place. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting harsh shadows on the grimy walls. The air smelled of sweat and stale coffee, and an oppressive silence hung in the air. Harold was dragged into a stark interrogation room. Gum Chewer and Swagger Boy assumed their roles, playing bad cop and worse cop. The questions continued, each one more ridiculous than the last. Your car matches the description of a getaway vehicle, Swagger Boy accused. Harold laughed, a deep, resonant laugh that filled the room. A getaway car? Man, that thing can barely get away from a red light. The officers didn't appreciate his humor, but Harold didn't care. He'd been through worse than this. He wasn't about to let two overzealous rookies intimidate him. Hours passed, and the officers' facade of confidence began to crack. They had nothing. No evidence, no case. Just their egos and an old man who refused to break. Finally, they released Harold, their defeat evident in their scowls. As Harold walked out of the station, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, he felt a surge of pride. They might have wasted his time, but they hadn't taken his dignity. His Cadillac waited for him, a loyal companion in a world that often felt anything but. As he drove home, Harold thought about his grandkids, especially Marcus. He smiled, knowing that while the world could be cruel and unjust, the strength to endure and rise above it was a legacy he'd passed down. Harold Wilkins was more than a survivor. He was a man who refused to be broken, a legend in his own right. Harold Wilkins was a man who wore his years like a badge of honor. At 67, his frame still hinted at the strength that once felled trees with bare hands. His silver-streaked hair framed a face weathered by decades of living through hell and high water. Vietnam veteran, retired mechanic grandfather, Harold was a testament to resilience. His life wasn't glamorous, but it was his own. His prized possession was a 1978 black Cadillac, a relic from another time. Despite its sputtering engine and rusted corners, Harold treated it like a treasure. It reminded him of simpler times and gave him something to tinker with between visits from his grandchildren, especially Marcus, his eldest. Marcus was an enigma, always on assignments that required discretion. Harold never pried. Family was family. Harold's neighborhood in Memphis was far from idyllic. Sirens often pierced the night, and the streetlights flickered as if unsure whether to stay on. Yet Harold never complained. Life had taught him that complaining changed nothing. One humid Friday night, Harold drove home from a grocery run. The roads were quiet, save for the occasional raccoon darting under the hazy glow of streetlights. The Cadillac chugged along, accompanied by the raw and honest strains of an old blues tune crackling through the radio. Then came the flash of red and blue in his rear-view mirror. The sinking feeling was immediate, but Harold, unfazed, muttered, "Here we go." Pulling over, he watched as two young officers emerged from the patrol car, both white. One chewed gum obnoxiously, while the other wore an air of self-importance. "Evening, sir," Gum Chewer greeted, his flashlight blinding Harold. "Mind telling us what you're doing out this late?" Harold, his voice steady, replied, "Driving home. Last I checked, that's not a crime." The exchange spiraled. Harold's license and registration were demanded. Swagger Boy, as Harold had silently dubbed the other cop, circled the car, peering into the back seat as if expecting contraband. "What's in the trunk?" Swagger Boy asked, his tone accusatory. Harold chuckled dryly. "Bodies, obviously. Or maybe just a spare tire and some tools." Want to see for yourself." The officer's demeanor shifted. They weren't here to chat. They asked Harold to step out, patted him down, and peppered him with inane questions about his whereabouts. Harold's patience wore thin, but his sarcasm remained intact. "Robbery? Seriously? At my age? I'm more of a fall asleep on the couch type than a getaway driver." The officers weren't amused. Soon, cuffs were slapped on his wrists. "You're being detained for questioning," Swagger Boy announced. "For what?" Harold demanded. "We'll figure that out," Gum Chewer quipped with a grin that churned Harold's stomach. As they drove him to the station, Harold stared out of the cruiser's window, his mind a whirlwind. He knew this wasn't about justice. It was about power. But Harold wasn't one to break easily. The station was a fluorescent-lit purgatory. Harold was dumped in an interrogation room, subjected to hours of baseless accusations and empty threats. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate the young officers. "You've got nothing," Harold finally said, his voice unwavering. "So why don't we cut the crap?" When they finally threw him into a holding cell, Harold sat on the cold bench, his expression unreadable. But inside, he was calculating. The next morning, Harold was escorted into a courtroom that buzzed with monotony. The prosecutor, a smug man in a cheap suit, painted Harold as a prime suspect in a robbery. He presented grainy security footage of a car leaving the scene. "That could be any car," Harold retorted, his tone razor-sharp. The judge, unimpressed, leaned back in her chair, clearly skeptical of the prosecution's case. Then, the courtroom doors swung open. Marcus entered, his tailored suit and commanding presence silencing the room. He strode to the judge, handed over a folder, and said, "Your Honor, this will clarify everything." The judge's expression shifted as she reviewed the documents. "Mr. Wilkins," she said finally, "you were nowhere near the scene of the crime. You are free to go." Harold adjusted his jacket and turned to Marcus. "You've been busy," he muttered. Outside the courthouse, Harold lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "So, are you going to tell me how you pulled that off?" Marcus smirked. "Let's just say I have connections." "Connections, huh?" Harold eyed his grandson. "You better not be running some underground poker ring." Marcus laughed. "Not exactly. Let's just get you home." The old Cadillac, waiting faithfully at the curb, seemed almost triumphant. As Harold climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced at Marcus in the passenger seat. "Next time, warn me before pulling stunts like this," Harold said, a grin tugging at his lips. "No promises," Marcus replied, his tone light but his eyes serious. Harold chuckled, the sound deep and rich. He turned the key, and the Cadillac roared to life. As they drove off, the city's chaos faded behind them. For Harold, this was just another chapter in his long, storied life. And he wasn't about to let anyone write his ending for him. The parking lot outside the courthouse buzzed with the low hum of cicadas and the occasional rumble of passing cars. Harold Wilkins leaned against his old Cadillac, his weathered hands brushing against the cool, rusted metal. The morning sun had begun to warm the air, but Harold's mind was still chilled by the events of the past 24 hours. His grandson, Marcus, stood beside him, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit. The contrast between the two couldn't have been starker. Harold, in his scuffed boots and a plaid shirt that had seen better days, and Marcus, with his crisp appearance and calm, calculating demeanor. Yet, the bond between them was undeniable. "You're telling me," Harold began, his voice tinged with disbelief, "that when the local PD tries to pin a robbery on an old war veteran without a shred of real evidence, it somehow gets noticed by folks like you?" Marcus tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Let's just say I work for people who don't like messy situations. When I heard about this, let's call it a misstep, I made a few calls." Harold squinted at his grandson, suspicion flickering in his sharp gray eyes. "Are you telling me you're some kind of secret agent now? CIA? FBI? What is it, Marcus? You got a badge or some title I should know about?" Marcus leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a sharp, controlled whisper. "Grandpa, it's better if you don't know the details. Let's just say I have connections. And those connections don't take kindly to people abusing their authority." Harold let out a low chuckle, equal parts disbelief and pride. "So, what? You've got internal affairs on speed dial now? Or is this some covert operation to save your old man from rotting in a holding cell?" Marcus's grin widened, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Something like that. And those cops who dragged you in, let's just say their lives are about to get very complicated." As if on cue, the screech of tires tore through the air. 2 squad cars skidded into the courthouse parking lot, their lights flashing, though their sirens remained off. Harold straightened, his brow furrowing as he watched the scene unfold. The same 2 officers who had cuffed him the night before stepped out of their vehicle, their expressions smug, as if still riding the high of their perceived victory. But their confidence didn't last. 2 men in sleek black suits emerged from a nearby sedan, their movements deliberate and commanding. Without hesitation, the suits approached the officers, flipping open badges that gleamed in the sunlight. Harold couldn't hear the exchange, but the color draining from the officers' faces told him everything he needed to know. Panic replaced their smugness as one of the suited men gestured toward the precinct, his tone unmistakably authoritative. Harold crossed his arms, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. "Looks like karma decided to clock in early today." Marcus adjusted his tie, his posture as cool and collected as ever. "They'll learn not to mess with the wrong people, especially not family." Harold took a final drag from his cigarette before flicking it to the ground and crushing it under his boot. He turned to Marcus, clapping him on the shoulder with a firm, approving hand. "Good job, kid. But next time, how about giving me a heads up before I end up spending the night in a cell?" Marcus laughed, the sound rich and easy. "Where's the fun in that, Grandpa?" Shaking his head, Harold opened the door to his Cadillac and slid into the driver's seat. Marcus followed, settling into the passenger side. The old engine roared to life, a sound both comforting and triumphant. As they pulled out of the lot, Harold rolled down the window, letting the crisp morning air whip past him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harold felt something rare, a sense of justice, sharp and undeniable. He glanced at Marcus, his voice lighter than it had been all night. "Remind me to buy you a damn drink." Marcus smirked, glancing at his grandfather. "You're buying the first round, old man." The Cadillac disappeared down the street, the hum of its engine fading into the city's backdrop. For Harold, the ordeal was a stark reminder of the world's injustices, but also of the importance of standing firm, and of having someone in your corner who refuses to let the system win.